Rachel Bennett was sitting in her new penthouse when the evening business program cut to a segment she almost ignored. On screen, a vintage black food truck filled the frame, hand-painted letters across the side reading Evelyn's Kitchen. She laughed at first, a short, dismissive sound, because the man standing in front of that truck was Ryan Cole, her ex-husband, the man who had walked out of their marriage 6 months ago with $300 and a battered suitcase. She assumed he was on television to complain, maybe to ask for sympathy. Then the host introduced him as the founder of Atlanta's fastest-growing food startup. Rachel's smile disappeared completely. Ryan Cole had never been the kind of man who needed much to feel at home. A decent knife, a clean cutting board, and something worth cooking, that was enough. He had grown up in Savannah, Georgia, in a small house near the water, where his grandmother Evelyn ran her kitchen like it was the most important room in the world, because to her, it was. She cooked for neighbors who couldn't afford groceries, for friends going through hard times, for strangers who somehow always ended up at her back door around dinner time. She never made a fuss about it. She just cooked, and people came, and for a few hours everything felt manageable again. Ryan learned to cook standing beside her, barely tall enough to see over the counter. She taught him to taste before seasoning, to listen to the sound of a roux, to treat every ingredient like it had a purpose. When she passed, she left him very little in the way of money or property. What she left him was a spiral-bound notebook, its cover soft with age, filled from front to back with her handwriting. Recipes, notes, small observations about food and people, and the way the two were always connected. Ryan had kept it in a drawer for years without opening it. Not because he didn't care, but because opening it meant acknowledging she was really gone. He had built a life that looked stable from the outside. His woodworking shop in Savannah did steady business, custom furniture, mostly the kind of work that took patience and left calluses. He wasn't getting rich, but he wasn't struggling either. Then he met Rachel Bennett at a fundraising dinner for a local arts organization, and within 2 years they were married. Rachel was sharp, confident, and relentlessly focused. She had built her real estate business from almost nothing, and she wore that fact like a second skin. Ryan admired her drive. In the beginning, they worked well together. Her ambition and his steadiness felt like balance, but balance has a way of shifting when one side keeps adding weight. As Rachel's business grew, the version of Ryan she needed changed. She needed a man who could host a dinner party on short notice and make it look effortless. She needed someone who could renovate the guest bathroom before a client visit and hang the right art on the walls and make sure the wine was correct for the occasion. Ryan did all of it willingly because he loved her and because he was genuinely good at those things. What he didn't notice, not for a long time, was that doing all of it had quietly replaced everything else. The woodworking shop began to feel like a hobby she tolerated. His opinions and conversations began to go unfinished. At dinner parties he hosted with his own hands, Rachel would introduce him with a vague gesture and move on to the next guest before he could say a word. He told himself it was just a phase, that she was under pressure, that things would level out. He told himself this for 3 years. The first real sign came at a dinner Rachel hosted for a group of investors. She was courting for a new development project. Ryan had spent 2 days cooking a full Southern spread, every dish made from scratch, the kind of meal that takes real knowledge to pull off at that scale. Halfway through the evening, one of the investors leaned over to Rachel and said the food was extraordinary, asked who had catered it. Rachel smiled and said she'd found a wonderful little catering company. She didn't look at Ryan once. He was standing 6 feet away refilling a water pitcher, and he heard every word. He set the pitcher down carefully and went back to the kitchen and finished cleaning up. And he didn't say anything about it that night, or the next morning, or ever, because by then he had already learned that bringing it up would cost him more than letting it go. What he didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, was that Rachel had spent the better part of that year building a legal wall around every shared asset they had. She worked with a financial attorney. Ryan had never met someone she saw during lunch hours and weekend mornings, when Ryan assumed she was at the office. By the time Ryan understood what was happening, the architecture was already complete. Joint accounts had been drained, and redirected. The house was structured under a holding company in her name. The car was leased under her business entity. And the woodworking shop, the one thing Ryan had built entirely on his own before they ever met, had been partially liquidated through a share transfer Ryan had signed without reading closely during a refinancing process 2 years earlier. He had trusted her. That was the mechanism she used. The divorce papers came on a Tuesday morning. Ryan read them at the kitchen table, the same table he had built himself from reclaimed oak, the same table where he had cooked breakfast for her hundreds of times. The documents were dense and precise and left almost no room for challenge, not without a legal team he couldn't afford, because the accounts he would have used to pay for one had already been moved. He sat with the papers for a long time. Then he signed them, because fighting would have cost him more than he had, and because some part of him already knew it was over. In a way that had nothing to do with the paperwork, he left the house with $300 in cash, a suitcase that had seen better days, and Evelyn's notebook. Rachel watched him go from the front window. She didn't come outside. Leonard Brooks lived across town in a house with a 2-car garage he only used for 1 car, which meant the other half had become a slow accumulation of failed ambitions, a broken espresso machine from the cafe he'd tried to open in 2017, stacked cardboard boxes, a folding table, a mini fridge that still worked. Leonard had known Ryan for over a decade, long enough to show up the same evening Ryan called, and long enough not to ask too many questions. He cleared out enough space for a cot plugged in the mini fridge and told Ryan to stay as long as he needed. Leonard had his own history with restaurants. He'd spent 4 years trying to make a neighborhood bistro work before the lease and the margins, and one very bad winter finally took it down. He understood what it felt like to build something and watch it not survive. He didn't say any of that. He just handed Ryan a spare key and went back inside. Ryan slept badly for the first week. The garage was not uncomfortable exactly, but it was quiet in a way that pressed on him, and when he wasn't sleeping, he was thinking through the arithmetic of his situation in ways that never came out well. $300. No shop, no home, no clear path. He had skills, he knew that. But skills don't pay rent while you're figuring out how to deploy them, and the kind of work he'd always done required tools and space and startup time he didn't have. On the 8th night, he couldn't sleep at all. He sat up on the cot at 2 in the morning with no particular reason to be awake, and reached for the one thing he had brought that wasn't practical. Evelyn's notebook had been sitting in the outside pocket of his suitcase since the day he packed it, and he hadn't opened it since before the marriage, maybe longer. He opened it that night with the careful deliberateness of someone handling something irreplaceable, which it was. Her handwriting was small and unhurried. The recipes were written with the assumption that the reader already knew the basics. She never explained what medium heat meant or how to tell when an onion was properly softened, because she'd taught those things in person, standing at the stove. But the margins were full of other things. Small notes, observations, a line she had apparently liked from a book she never named. And between a recipe for shrimp gumbo and one for sweet potato biscuits, a sentence in slightly darker ink, as if she had pressed harder when she wrote it. The food is never really about the food. It's about making people feel like they matter. Ryan read that line several times. Then he closed the notebook and sat in the dark for a long while, not thinking about Rachel, not running the arithmetic. Just sitting with what his grandmother had understood about cooking that he had lost somewhere along the way, or maybe never fully grasped when she was alive to show him. He had cooked for years inside Rachel's world, but he had cooked for her image, for her dinner parties, for the impression she needed to maintain. The people who had eaten his food at those events, the ones who pulled Rachel aside and called it extraordinary, they had felt something real without knowing where it came from. That part had been his. That had always been his. The next morning, Ryan took stock of what $300 could actually do. He walked to a grocery supply store 2 miles from Leonard's house and spent just under $220 on ingredients: dried andouille Trinity vegetables, a bag of long-grain rice bread flour butter, smoked paprika, a case of chicken thighs. He borrowed Leonard's largest pot and the folding table that had been leaning against the garage wall. He called the coordinator for the day labor market on Fulton Street, explained that he wanted to set up outside the lot for a few hours on Saturday morning, and the man on the phone told him to show up before 6 and stay out of the entrance lane. He was there at 5:45. He set up the folding table, got the burner going under the pot, and had a full batch of gumbo simmering before the first workers started arriving at 7. He'd also made a tray of sandwiches, thick-cut bread, pulled chicken, a mustard he'd built from scratch the night before in Leonard's kitchen. He priced everything low, just enough to cover the next batch of ingredients and leave a few dollars over. By 8:30, the line extended past the end of the block. It wasn't the volume that surprised him. It was the way people ate. Not quickly, not absently, the way people eat when food is just fuel. They ate like it meant something. A man in a paint-stained jacket asked him what was in the gumbo, and when Ryan told him it was his grandmother's recipe, the man nodded slowly and said his own grandmother used to make something close to it back in Louisiana. And for a moment, they were just two people standing on a sidewalk in Atlanta, talking about someone they missed. Ryan gave him an extra portion and didn't charge for it. He went home that evening with $63 in his pocket after restocking for the following week. Leonard asked how it went. Ryan said it went fine. But something had shifted in him that he couldn't fully articulate. Yet a recalibration, quiet and stubborn like a compass, finding north after years of pointing the wrong direction. He had stood on a sidewalk with a borrowed pot and a folding table, and made something from almost nothing, and people had come. And for a few hours on a Saturday morning in Atlanta, he had been exactly the person his grandmother had tried to raise him to be. He wrote down every dollar he spent and every dollar he made in a small notebook he bought for 99 cents. He dated the first entry and kept it short. Day 1, $63 clear. Start again tomorrow. Rachel, meanwhile, had moved into the penthouse she'd been eyeing for the better part of a year. It was everything she'd wanted. Clean lines, floor-to-ceiling windows, a kitchen she would almost never use. She told her colleagues the divorce had been mutual, amicable, overdue. She said Ryan had been a good man, but they had simply grown in different directions. She said it the way you say something you've practiced smoothly and without texture. And most people accepted it because Rachel had always been persuasive, and because the version she offered was simpler than the truth. What she did not tell anyone was that she had thought about Ryan exactly once in the first week after he left. Not with guilt, but with a faint unease. She couldn't name the kind that surfaces when you've made a decision that was strategically correct and emotionally not quite settled. She filed it away. She had always been good at that. She had a new development project launching in the spring, a networking event to prepare for, and a life that by every visible measure was moving exactly as she had planned. Ryan Cole was a closed chapter, and closed chapters did not require her attention. She was certain of that. She was certain of it right up until the evening she sat in her penthouse and a television program showed her a black food truck on a street in Atlanta, and a man she had once watched walk away with a suitcase, and $300 was being introduced to a national audience as someone worth knowing. The $63 became $112 the following Saturday. The $112 became $240 the Saturday after that, because word had moved the way word moves in working neighborhoods, not through advertising or algorithms, but through one person telling another person that the food was worth the detour. Ryan kept his setup simple. The folding table, the burner, the pot. He added a second item to the menu, new sweet potato biscuits from Evelyn's notebook, baked in Leonard's oven before dawn and wrapped in foil to stay warm. They sold out before 9 in the morning. Leonard watched all of this from a careful distance. He had been through his own version of building something and losing it, and he understood that unsolicited advice from someone who had failed was not always the gift it felt like to offer. But one evening, about 3 weeks in, he sat across from Ryan at the kitchen table and said what he'd been thinking. He told Ryan that what he was doing on that sidewalk every Saturday was not sustainable as a sidewalk operation, that the food was genuinely good, better than good, and that good food with no permanent address eventually loses to good food with a sign and a fixed location. Ryan knew Leonard was right. The problem was the same problem it had always been. He had no capital, no equipment, and no collateral that any lender would take seriously. The permit situation alone was a maze. Operating on public property required a temporary food vendor license, which Ryan had applied for and was waiting on, but a proper mobile food unit, a truck with a commercial kitchen setup, certified by the county health department, required a different class of license entirely, plus proof of equipment, plus an inspection, plus fees he couldn't cover with what he was currently earning. He mapped it all out in his 99-cent notebook, column by column, and the gap between where he was and where he needed to be was significant enough to feel on certain nights like it was designed to keep people like him exactly where they were. Rachel, during this same stretch of weeks, was telling a story about Ryan at a dinner with two colleagues. The story was light and faintly cruel, the kind of story that lets the teller feel superior without having to say so directly. She described his departure with the $300, and the old suitcase let her colleagues fill in the rest with their expressions, and moved on without lingering. She said she genuinely hoped he landed on his feet somewhere. She said it in the tone people use when they don't actually mean it, but want credit for saying it. And her colleagues nodded and changed the subject. And that was the last time Ryan Cole came up in her social world for a while. What no one at that table knew was that 4 miles away, a man in a borrowed garage was quietly building something that had nothing to do with her timeline. The food truck came from a situation Ryan would not have predicted. On a Thursday afternoon, in his 5th week out, he was walking back from a supply run when he passed a lot behind an auto repair shop on Memorial Drive. Sitting at the back of the lot, half hidden behind a chain-link fence, was the shell of an old catering truck. White paint gone gray, one side panel dented in the serving window, stuck open at a 45-degree angle. A handwritten sign taped to the fence said, "Not for sale. Ask inside anyway." Ryan went inside anyway. The shop owner, a man named Gary Tillman, who had been running the place for over 20 years, had inherited the truck from a cousin who'd briefly tried the lunch route business before giving up. Gary had no use for it, no room to sell it legitimately, and no patience for the process of scrapping it. He told Ryan straight the truck wasn't going anywhere useful unless someone took it as a project. Ryan looked at it for a long time, through the chain link, taking in the rust along the wheel wells, the warped panel above the serving window, the general exhaustion of something that had been left outside through too many Georgia summers. Then he asked Gary if he could bring some people by on Saturday to take a look. Gary shrugged and said the coffee would be on. The people Ryan brought were 4 mechanics from the labor market lot, men who had been regulars at his Saturday setup, who had eaten his food and talked to him long enough to know he wasn't running any kind of angle. Ryan explained what he was trying to do. He told them the truth: he had almost no money, the truck needed significant work, and he couldn't pay them in cash. What he could offer was this: every Saturday for as long as it took, he would cook for them and whoever they wanted to bring, using whatever was in the notebook. No charge, no limit, no expiration. One of the mechanics, a man named Dale Pruitt, who had spent 15 years doing fleet restoration work for a trucking company, looked at the truck for a long time, and then looked at Ryan and said that was probably the best deal he'd been offered in years. They started the following weekend. Dale brought 2 others from his network, both of whom had the kind of mechanical knowledge that comes from decades of working on things that couldn't afford to break down. Leonard showed up with a socket set and stayed until dark. Gary Tillman kept the lot open late on Sundays and eventually started bringing coffee out in the mornings without being asked, then started staying to watch the work, then started handing tools when someone needed a second pair of hands. He never said much. He just showed up, which turned out to be its own kind of contribution. The work took 6 weeks in total weekends, mostly some evenings after the day labor market closed. What emerged from that lot on Memorial Drive was not a perfect vehicle, but it was a real one. The dent was hammered out. The serving window was repaired and fitted with a new track. The interior was stripped down to bare metal and rebuilt with a 2-burner commercial range, a proper prep surface, and a compact refrigeration unit that Dale had sourced from a restaurant equipment liquidator for almost nothing. The wheel wells were treated and sealed. The wiring was checked and partly replaced. When Dale finally started the engine on a Sunday afternoon, and it turned over clean on the second try, the four men standing around it made the kind of noise people make when something that was broken becomes something that works. Ryan spent his remaining cash on paint. He chose black, a flat matte black that made the truck look deliberate rather than improvised. He painted the name himself in clean white letters along both sides Evelyn's kitchen. He stood back and looked at it for a long time when it was done, and he felt something he had not felt in years. Not pride exactly. More like recognition, like the thing he was looking at had always existed somewhere, and he had simply finally found the right form for it. Getting the mobile food unit permit took another 3 weeks of paperwork, 2 inspection visits, and 1 rejected application that required a correction and resubmission. Ryan handled all of it himself, without a lawyer or a consultant at the public library, 2 blocks from Leonard's house, using the free computer terminals. He made mistakes, corrected them, and made notes so he wouldn't make the same ones again. When the permit finally came through, Leonard opened 2 beers and they sat in the garage and didn't say much, which was exactly the right way to mark it. The first day Evelyn's kitchen operated as a licensed mobile unit, Ryan parked on a stretch of Edgewood Avenue that got steady foot traffic from the warehouse district workers on their lunch break. He had a 3-item menu printed on cardstock and taped inside the serving window: gumbo, pulled chicken sandwich, sweet potato biscuit. That was it. No substitutions, no specials, no upsells. He sold out of everything by 1:30 in the afternoon and drove back to Leonard's with an empty truck and more money in the cash box than he had made in any single day since the divorce. Within 6 weeks of that first licensed day, the line at Evelyn's kitchen was a fixture. It built the way real things build gradually and without announcement. A food blogger who worked nearby posted a photo of the gumbo with a caption that described it as the best thing she'd eaten in Atlanta that year. The post got shared widely enough that Ryan noticed a different kind of customer starting to appear, people who had driven 20 minutes. Specifically, people who mentioned the post, people who had never been to that part of Edgewood Avenue before. He adjusted his hours and started a second service window on Thursday evenings. The cash box numbers climbed steadily, and Ryan tracked every dollar with the same discipline he had applied from the beginning. It was during this period that a segment producer for a local business program reached out through the contact form Ryan had set up on a simple website Leonard had helped him build. The program covered Atlanta startups and small business stories, and someone on their team had seen the food blogger's post and done enough research to think there was a story worth telling. Ryan did not respond immediately. He read the message twice, set his phone down, and spent the next morning's prep thinking about it while he worked. His instinct was to decline. He did not want the business to become a story about the divorce, about Rachel, about loss and comeback, and the neat narrative arc that television liked to build around those things. He wanted it to be about the food, about Evelyn, about what the truck actually was. He called the producer back and said he would do the interview on one condition: that the segment focused on the food and the community around it, not on his personal history. The producer agreed. Ryan believed her mostly. Rachel heard about the segment from a colleague who had seen a promotional clip shared on a local business network. The colleague mentioned it in passing, the way you mentioned something minor, and Rachel absorbed it without reacting. That evening alone in the penthouse, she looked up the program and found the clip. It was 40 seconds long, just Ryan at the truck, talking to a customer, the camera catching the line behind him, and the name on the side panel in clean white letters. She watched it once, then she watched it again. She sat very still in a way that had nothing to do with composure, and everything to do with the sudden, unwelcome arrival of a question she had not previously needed to ask herself. Had she misjudged him, or had she simply never looked? She told herself it didn't matter. He had a food truck. She had a development portfolio worth several $1 million. The comparison was absurd. She poured a glass of wine and moved on with her evening, and told herself she felt nothing about it, which was how she knew she felt something about it. The segment aired on a Tuesday. Ryan had not watched it live. He was prepping for Wednesday's service. and Leonard had the television on in the next room. He heard his own voice briefly and kept chopping, but the morning after it aired, the website contact form had over 200 new messages. His phone had notifications he couldn't keep up with, and when he arrived at Edgewood Avenue at 10 in the morning, there were already people waiting who had never been there before. By noon, the line stretched past the corner. He sold out by 12:40 and had to close the window and tell the remaining people in line that he was sorry, that he would be back Thursday, that he would make more next time. A man near the back of the line, someone who had clearly waited a while, said something, as Ryan was apologizing, that stayed with him for a long time afterward. The man said he wasn't even that hungry, that he just wanted to see the place the segment had described, that it reminded him of something from a long time ago he hadn't thought about in years. Ryan asked what that was. The man said his mother had run a small lunch counter in Macon when he was growing up, and watching the clip had made him feel like that place still existed somewhere in the world. He said it simply without sentimentality, the way people say things that are completely true. Ryan stood there with an empty truck and a line of people he couldn't feed that day, and thought about what his grandmother had written in the margin between the gumbo and the biscuits. He had read those words in a garage at 2 in the morning, when he had nothing, and he had understood them as an idea. Standing on Edgewood Avenue, listening to a man talk about his mother's lunch counter, he understood them as a fact about the world that had always been true, and that he was only now living up to. He drove back to Leonard's that afternoon with an empty truck, a full cash box, and the clear knowledge that what he had built had outgrown its current container. The question was not whether to grow. The question was how to grow without losing the thing that made people wait in a line past the corner on a Wednesday morning to eat food from a black truck with a woman's name on the side. That was the question he brought into the weeks that followed. And it was also, though he did not know it yet, the question that was about to make Rachel Bennett very uncomfortable. The message from Rachel came on a Thursday morning 3 days after the segment aired. Ryan saw her name on his phone screen while he was standing at the prep counter inside the truck, and he set the phone face down and finished what he was doing before he picked it up again. The message was brief and carefully worded. She said she had seen the program, that she was genuinely glad things were going well, and that she thought it might be good for both of them to talk sometime. No agenda, just to clear the air. The phrasing was classic Rachel, reasonable on the surface, engineered underneath. Ryan read it. Once put the phone in his back pocket, and spent the rest of the morning service thinking about what clearing the air actually meant to a woman who had spent a year quietly moving assets out of reach before handing him divorce papers at a kitchen table. He did not respond that day. He did not respond the day after. When Leonard asked if anything was going on, Ryan showed him the message. Leonard read it, handed the phone back, and said that in his experience, people who said they had no agenda were the ones most likely to have one. Ryan said he knew. He left the message unanswered and moved forward. What Ryan did not know was that Rachel's outreach was not as casual as it appeared. She had spent the days since the segment aired doing something she rarely did, reassessing. The version of Ryan she had filed away, the quietly capable man she had decided was not ambitious enough, not driven enough, not the right fit for the life she was building, did not match the man on that program. The man on that program had built something from nothing in less than 6 months, had a following, had a story that people were responding to in a way that felt genuine and durable. Rachel understood business well enough to recognize traction when she saw it, and what Evelyn's kitchen had was traction. The unease she had been filing away came back sharper this time, not as guilt exactly, but as the particular discomfort of someone who made a calculated decision and is beginning to suspect the calculation was wrong. She reached out because she wanted to understand what she was looking at. She told herself it was concern. It was not concern. Ryan's appearance on the full program, not just the promotional clip, but the complete sit-down segment, was scheduled for the following Tuesday. The producer had structured it as a conversation about building a food business from the ground up, and Ryan had prepared for it the way he prepared for a service day, by knowing exactly what he was there to do, and not getting distracted by the surrounding noise. He arrived at the studio in a clean shirt and the same boots he wore every day at the truck, because he had decided early on that he was not going to perform a version of himself that the television lights required. He was going to be exactly who he was, and let that be enough or not enough. The host was a polished man named Marcus Webb, who had been doing the program for several years. He ran through the business story. First, the $300 the folding table on Fulton Street, the mechanics on Memorial Drive, the permit process, the line on Edgewood Avenue that had become a fixture. Ryan answered everything directly, and without embellishment, because the facts were already more than enough, and he had never seen the point of decorating them. Marcus was good at his job, and the conversation moved well, and for most of the segment, it was exactly what Ryan had asked for it to be, a story about food and community, and what it looked like to build something real from almost nothing. The last question was different. Marcus leaned forward slightly and shifted his tone from professional curiosity to something more personal. He asked Ryan whether, if he could go back and change anything about the path that had led him here, he would. Ryan understood what Marcus was doing. He was inviting Ryan to talk about the divorce, about Rachel, about the loss, to give the audience the emotional through line that made a business story into a human story. It was a reasonable thing to want for television. Ryan had expected something like it. He looked straight into the camera and said what he actually thought. He said he had lost everything that other people considered the markers of a successful life, and in doing so had found the only thing that had ever actually belonged to him. He said the food truck existed because a woman he had loved had taken everything else, and he was not angry about that anymore, because what she had taken turned out to be things he had never really needed. What she could not take was the notebook, and the knowledge and the understanding of what food was actually for. He said all of this without drama and without performance, in the same steady voice he used to talk to customers at the window, and when he finished, the studio was very quiet for a moment, before Marcus Webb nodded slowly, and the audience responded with the kind of applause that doesn't feel like politeness. That clip moved fast. By the next morning, it had been shared across multiple platforms, picked up by 2 national food media accounts, and embedded in 3 separate articles about resilience and entrepreneurship. The comments were overwhelming in their consistency, people talking about their own experiences of losing. Something they thought defined them, people who had eaten at the truck and felt something they couldn't name, people who had never heard of Evelyn's Kitchen, but said they were going to find it. Ryan read some of the comments, and then stopped reading them because the attention felt like weather, real and significant, and completely outside his control. The investment conversations that followed were immediate. 2 separate groups reached out within 48 hours of the clip going wide. A regional grocery chain with locations across Georgia and into Tennessee sent a formal letter of interest through the website contact form. A restaurant group that operated casual dining concepts in 4 southern cities, called Leonard's Number, which was listed as a secondary contact on the permit paperwork. Ryan sat across from Leonard at the kitchen table that evening, with all of it laid out in front of them, the messages, the letter, the call notes. And Leonard said quietly that this was the part where a lot of people made the mistake that cost them everything they had worked for. Ryan asked him what he meant. Leonard said he meant that capital had a way of arriving with a story about what it was going to do for you, and that story was almost always more about the capital than about you. He said he had signed a partnership agreement in 2016 that had sounded like support and had functioned like a slow acquisition, and that by the time he understood what had happened, his name was on the door, but the decisions were being made by people who had never eaten at his restaurant. He said Ryan should take the meetings, take the time, and not sign anything until he understood exactly what he was agreeing to become. Ryan listened to all of that carefully. Leonard had earned the right to say it. Ryan took the meetings. He drove to them in the truck, which he parked outside the office buildings, because he had nowhere else to leave it, and also because he had decided, without quite saying so out loud, that it was useful for people in those rooms to see it and remember what they were actually talking about. The grocery chain meeting lasted 40 minutes. They wanted exclusivity on a packaged product line, jarred gumbo-based dry rub mixes, branded sauces to be developed with their private label team and manufactured at scale. The margins they offered were reasonable. The terms required Ryan to license the Evelyn's Kitchen name to a subsidiary for a period of 10 years, with options to extend. He listened to all of it, asked several questions, and left without giving them an answer. The restaurant group was different in approach, but similar in outcome. They were interested in a brick-and-mortar expansion, 2 or 3 locations built around the truck's menu, and aesthetic funded by their capital, operated under a management structure they would control. Ryan would retain a percentage serve as creative director and appear in marketing materials. He would have no operational authority over staffing, sourcing, or pricing. He listened to that presentation even more carefully, and left even more quietly. It was during the week between those meetings and his decision about them that Rachel made her second move. The first message had been personal. The second was legal. Ryan received a letter from an attorney he didn't recognize, informing him that Rachel Bennett was claiming a partial interest in the Evelyn's Kitchen brand, on the grounds that the business concept had been developed during the period of their marriage, and potentially used assets, including the letter suggested, culinary knowledge and techniques developed and applied during joint household operations that constituted marital property under Georgia law. The argument was thin enough that Leonard's expression when he read it was closer to disbelief than alarm, but it was specific enough to create real problems. 2 of the smaller investor conversations Ryan had been having went quiet immediately. After word got around the way word always gets around in business, communities faster than anyone expects, Ryan called a legal aid attorney he had found through the county bar referral service, a woman named Patricia Hale, who handled small business disputes, and who after 20 minutes on the phone told Ryan that the claim was aggressive and opportunistic, but not without procedural teeth, meaning it would cost time and money to resolve, even if the outcome was never in doubt. Ryan didn't have the money for a prolonged legal fight. What he had was the notebook, physical dated, with Evelyn's handwriting on every page, and a clear paper trail showing that every recipe on his menu predated the marriage by decades. Patricia told him that was meaningful. She also told him to say nothing publicly, to let her handle the correspondence, and to keep operating the truck as normal. Ryan did all 3. But the week the legal letter arrived was also the week a story appeared on a regional food blog, anonymous sourcing vague enough to be unactionable, suggesting that Ryan Cole had manufactured a personal narrative to generate publicity, that his financial history included a bankruptcy-adjacent situation with his woodworking business, and that the divorce story had been deliberately shaped for maximum sympathy. The details were wrong in specific ways that suggested someone had provided a version of events rather than done any actual research, but wrong details in a confident voice travel at the same speed as right ones, and Ryan watched 2 local restaurant accounts unfollow the truck's profile, and a catering inquiry he had been close to finalizing go silent. He sat in the truck that evening after service, the serving window closed, the city still going around him. He had the notebook on the prep counter in front of him, and his 99-cent ledger open beside it. The cash box was solid. The line had not shortened. The people who had eaten his food once were coming back, and they were bringing other people. None of that had changed. What had changed was the noise around the edges, and the noise was getting louder. And he understood that Rachel had looked at the momentum he had built and decided that the most efficient response was to make the ground uncertain under it. He thought about calling Leonard. He thought about calling Patricia Hale. Instead, he sat with the notebook open in front of him and let the city go quiet around the truck. He turned to the page he knew by feel, now the one between the gumbo and the biscuits, and read the line his grandmother had pressed harder than the rest. The food is never really about the food. It's about making people feel like they matter. He had carried those words from a garage at 2 a.m. through every service day since, and they had not changed. The people trying to destabilize him, the attorney's letter, the anonymous blog post, the quiet withdrawal of cautious money, none of them had any power over that principle. They could contest a name or a narrative, but they could not contest what happened. When someone stood at that window and received something made with care from a recipe a woman in Savannah had written down by hand decades ago. Ryan closed the notebook, closed the ledger, and locked the truck. He called Patricia Hale from the parking lot and left a message asking her to proceed with the full response to Rachel's attorney. Then he called Marcus Webb's producer and asked whether there was space in the next scheduled taping for a brief follow-up. She said there was always space for him. He said he'd be there Tuesday. He drove back to Leonard's in the dark, past the auto repair lot on Memorial Drive, where Gary Tillman's coffee had appeared on Sunday mornings, without being asked, past the spot where the truck had sat behind the chain-link fence, looking like something the world had finished with. He did not stop. He kept driving. The Tuesday taping was brief and direct. Marcus Webb did not ask a setup question this time. He simply gave Ryan the floor and let him use it. Ryan looked into the camera and said that someone had recently tried to claim ownership over a name that belonged to a woman who had spent her life feeding people who needed it, and that he wanted anyone watching to understand that the notebook was real. The recipes were real, and the name had been earned the only way a name like that can be earned, by doing the work every day without asking for anything back. He said it without anger, which made it land harder than anger would have. The audience in the studio was completely still while he spoke. When he finished, Marcus Webb said nothing for a moment, and then simply thanked him and moved on. That was enough. The clip from the second appearance spread even faster than the first. Patricia Hale called Ryan 2 days later to tell him that Rachel's attorney had indicated his client was reconsidering the claim. Within the week, the legal action was formally withdrawn. The grocery chain sent a revised letter of interest with significantly more favorable terms. The restaurant group called back and asked whether Ryan would be open to a different kind of conversation, one where his operational authority was not on the table. He said he was open to listening. Rachel watched the second clip alone in the penthouse the city spread out behind the floor-to-ceiling windows. She had built her response to Ryan's success around the assumption that he would eventually reach a point where the pressure became too much, where the cost of standing his ground exceeded what he was willing to pay. She had been wrong about that. She understood now, watching him on the screen for the second time, that she had been wrong about it from the beginning, not just about the legal strategy, but about the fundamental question of what Ryan Cole was made of. She had spent years in a house with him, and had looked past the answer every single time it was right in front of her. She turned the television off and sat in the quiet for a long time. Her real estate business was navigating a difficult market cycle. The development project she had been counting on had hit regulatory delays that pushed the timeline back by at least a year. 2 colleagues she had considered close had quietly distanced themselves after the legal story got around, because people in business communities notice when someone makes a move that reads as petty, and Rachel's move had read as petty to everyone who heard about it. She had money. She had the house and the portfolio and the professional reputation she had spent a decade building. What she was sitting with alone in that quiet was the specific and unforgiving recognition that she had made a series of decisions she could not undo, and that the person she had most underestimated had turned out to be the one person who had ever actually seen her clearly enough to love her without requiring her to perform. She did not call Ryan. She knew better than that now. Ryan, for his part, was not thinking about Rachel. He was in Leonard's kitchen at 6 in the morning, working through a new recipe from the back pages of the notebook, something Evelyn had written down, but apparently never made a sweet corn and crab bisque with notes in the margin that said, "Needs the right season. Needs patience." He had been thinking about it for weeks, and had decided this was the right time. Leonard came in around 6:30, poured himself a coffee, looked at what Ryan was doing, and sat down at the table without saying anything. The kitchen smelled like butter and fresh corn, and the particular warmth of something being made carefully. Outside, Atlanta was waking up. The truck was parked in the driveway, clean and black, the white letters steady on the side. Ryan tasted the bisque, adjusted the seasoning, and wrote a note in the margin next to Evelyn's. She was right. Needs patience. Worth it. A year after walking out of a house with $300 and a battered suitcase, Ryan Cole appeared on the cover of a regional business magazine under the headline, "The Man Who Turned $300 into an Atlanta Food Empire." The photo showed him standing in front of the truck on Edgewood Avenue, the serving window open, the line of people behind him extending out of frame. He was not smiling for the camera. He was looking slightly to the side, the way people look when they are thinking about something real. Inside the magazine, the profile mentioned the notebook twice. It mentioned Rachel Bennett once in a single sentence's context. It spent most of its pages on the food, on the community that had gathered around it, and on the people Ryan had hired, most of them from the labor market lots, and the kind of circumstances he understood from the inside. He kept the truck. Long after the central kitchen opened, long after the distribution conversations became contracts, and the name Evelyn's Kitchen was recognized well beyond Edgewood Avenue, the black food truck stayed in service on its original corner 2 days a week. Some of the mechanics who had rebuilt it in Gary Tillman's lot still stopped by on Thursdays. Gary himself came occasionally, always ordered the gumbo, and never paid for it, because Ryan would not allow it. Leonard handled the business side of things with a seriousness and precision that suggested he had been waiting his whole career for a project worth that kind of care. In the central kitchen above the prep line where the work began every morning, Ryan had framed 2 things side by side. One was a photograph of Evelyn in her kitchen in Savannah, taken sometime in the 1980s, her back to the camera, something on the stove in front of her. The other was the notebook open to the page between the gumbo and the biscuits, the handwriting visible behind the glass. Most of the staff knew what it said without having to read it. It had become the kind of thing that doesn't need to be explained, because it explains itself every day in the work. Ryan understood, in the way you understand things that take years to become clear, that nothing Rachel had taken from him had been the thing that mattered. The accounts, the house, the shop, those had been the scaffolding around a life he had been living for someone else's blueprint. What remained when the scaffolding came down was the only thing that had ever been fully his. The knowledge his grandmother had pressed into his hands, one recipe at a time, standing at a stove in Savannah, teaching him that the point was never the food itself. The point was what the food did for the person receiving it. The point was making someone feel even briefly like they mattered. He had built an empire on that sentence. He thought Evelyn would have found the word empire a little much. He thought she would have liked the truck.